So for me, video games are thrill divorced from physicality. Pornography is sexuality divorced from relationship, just as junk food is flavor divorced from nutrition. And in my own life, I've simply chosen to not do these things.
Hey, Rafe Kelley, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you, Thomas?
I'm good. So can you maybe start with just giving a little bit of your background and like your history with Evolve Move Play and how you got into all that, and then we can go into some of the questions I have.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'm, I guess, the founder of Evolve Move Play, which has evolved from its origins into a kind of ecology of practices for self cultivation. It's initially rooted in the practice of parkour. Um, I had a curiosity early on in my parkour training about what it would be like to take parkour into the natural world, because at the time it was highly associated with movement in urban environments. Um, and then in addition, I had a deep martial arts background and was very curious about the intersection between martial arts and parkour. And then over time, I became very interested in play research and the role of rough and tumble play and how we grow as human beings. And I found through my teaching that narrative and story was a really profound aspect of what made teaching powerful. And as I kind of looked at my ultimate motivations for my practice, I started asking a lot of questions about meaning. And then through the workshops and the retreats that taught, I came to realize that fundamentally all of us are really hungry for connection. That connection is ultimately what gives a sense of meaning in life, and that we can build practices that increase our capacity to experience connection. And those practices are actually most powerful when they're rooted in the body. So while a practice like parkour is very incomplete in certain ways, and it doesn't always achieve the kind of transformation from a character standpoint that one might hope from it, it has this really fundamental relationship with reality because you can actually do stuff or you actually can't. Um, and
Hmm.
you are interacting with the world when you do it. So from parkour through various other things that I explored, I came to this idea that fundamentally we're all in need of deeper integration and connection to the relationships internal to the self. So, mind and body, the different aspects of the psyche, the structures of the muscles, and coordination, integration, all that. The world around us as a landscape we can move through, from parkour to nature connection practices, the world as a set of tools that we can manipulate. So starting with sticks and balls and ropes, but taking that as far as you want. And then the world of other embodied agents that you can interact with. So how do we play and fight and dance and work with other living things? And then all of that in some sense sort of puts you at the cusp of the transcendent anyways. And so we don't, we're not a specifically religious practice, and people who engage with us and have come from various faith traditions. Um, but there is a sense that when we deeply embody these things, somehow we begin to touch the transcendent. And that's also an important part of the connection that people are hungry for in life. So that's what I've helped create over the years. And it came out of my passion for parkour and movement and nature.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting about what you were saying in one of your podcasts is like the effects of like limitations on play on like leading to like social aggression and violence and the studies on that. Could you speak on that for like a moment and like what your thoughts are on that? That'd be really cool.
Yeah, so there's a couple different lines of research on this. So there's various different lines of research that show that. Well, I'll start here. One of the first places that I saw that was when I was going to get a puppy, and I was starting to read up on puppy training, and they're talking about this was a book called The Serious Guide to Puppy Training, and I can't remember the author's name, but basically he was a dog trainer, and he said that when a puppy is eh, puppies have a very strong drive to bite things and to want to jaw spar with their mouths. And if you tell a puppy not to do that, and you punish it every time it does it, you're actually sort of taking away its capacity to explore what's natural to it. And dogs that are simply punished every time that they engage in this kind of behavior become more anxious and less safe and more likely to be fear biters and to have less ability um, to inhibit their bite force. So they don't have soft mouths. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. I bet human beings are like that too. I bet that if you don't allow kids to engage in rough and tumble play, it will actually damage their ability because they have to explore these things. I then came across the work of Frank Forencich and Stuart Brown. Stuart Brown, I think, got really turned on to play. I think actually, if I remember correctly, he has a book called Play, but if I remember correctly, his interest in play actually started through research on spree killers. He was looking for consistent relationships in the upbringings of spree killers, people who would, climb up a tower and shoot a bunch of people in one day. We found the one thing that was consistent was that every spree killer they looked at had been denied just open free play as a child, had been forced to live a super strict and kind of restricted life of drudgery and work. And so he thought there was something really profound and powerful about play. Then Jaak Panksepp's works on rats and various other work that came out of that on mink. And then I discovered Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson has a paper called The Regulation of Aggression. And in it, he documents how uh, young children who are more naturally antisocial and who are behavioral problems, the most powerful sort of tool to get them to learn to regulate their aggression is rough and tumble play. The theory is that rough and tumble play is highly motivating. And in order to play well, you have to have empathy because you have to be able to handicap yourself and you have to be able to play within the boundaries. And so, even though it's playing with violence, it is not the same as violence. And in being able to play with violence, we're sort of stress testing our ability to regulate our aggression better than any other tool or any other, educational approach available to us. So that's those are sort of some of the key touchstones that have really informed my thinking in advocating for the necessity for all of us to engage with competitive body to body play as a way of learning to understand ourselves as creatures that inherently come from a history of violence and know how to regulate that so that it is that strengthens us and empowers us without becoming a danger to us and to others around us.
And so, can you maybe break down like the different forms of play that you think are most useful categorization schemes for like rough and tumble play, locomotive play, and
Mm-hmm.
how how you think each it like what area of cognition and physicality it most benefits in like childhood development?
Mm. Yeah. So when I started reading the play research, and this was, over a decade ago, uh, I came across this breakdown of play into locomotor play. So if you imagine, take a bunch of kids to a playground and they start running up and sliding down and swinging on the monkey bars. This is an expression of locomotor play. And locomotor play, of course, is, in my opinion, the root from which parkour derives. And we could also say that something like gymnastics or calisthenics or tricking are all play. Even just running is a potential. You go on a trail run, that's a expression of locomotor play. Um, then there's manipulative play, playing with objects or object-oriented play. So object-oriented play would be playing with a puzzle, playing with a Rubik's cube, playing with a kendama, playing with ropes and strings and balls. Um, And then you have interactive play or rough and tumble play. And rough and tumble play is, in children, it's usually games of chase, games of wrestling, games of like guarding and holding on to spaces. Then if we look at something like a team sport, we'll see that it has elements of all of these, right? So if you're playing basketball, you got to be really good at running and jumping and cutting and changing direction. You have to be really good at manipulating an object, the ball. And then you have to be really good at interacting with other people. So you got to be able to coordinate, to throw the ball, catch the ball, see the intentions of other people, read people's intention, move around a defender, juke a defender out, set a screen, take impact, set up in the post, right? So they kind of incorporate a lot of these elements. And then as human beings, we also have narrative play. So kids like to tell stories. So they'll go climb a thing and they'll be like, "Look, I'm a ninja. I'm a pirate. I'm doing this." And of course, theater and things like this come out of our storytelling, our charades, are expressions of that. So if we think about what it might, kind of how it might educate us, the locomotor exploratory play essentially embeds us in our environment. So we can think about like the four E's model of cognition, right? In order to understand cognition, we have to understand cognition in the context of embodiment. The mind is itself continuous with a body, and how the mind perceives is based on body, and then it's embedded. It's that body is within an arena. It's within a landscape, and then it's extended. It's enacted, right? We understand our thoughts because they are essentially informed by actions, and then it's extended. It's something that is networked with other cognitive agents. So when we begin locomotor exploratory play, obviously all of these things essentially have an impact at the level of embodiment. Without running and jumping and climbing, we don't experience our body fully. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to the roughhousing, but it just happens to be really salient to me right now. My kids are wrestling. They're doing competitive folk style wrestling right now, and they work really. When you're in a wrestling engagement, it's very easy to end up at the absolute end of your exhaustion, right? Like really, really, you're trying your absolute hardest, and you're getting exhausted, and the other guy isn't giving up, and you're pushing and pushing and pushing. And what frequently happens is that they start crying, right? Even when they're winning, sometimes they're crying because they're trying so hard. But what's beautiful is that they recover very quickly from crying. And then they're extremely motivated to go back and wrestle some more. They really love it. They want to keep doing it. And I think about how few people have ever experienced their body being pushed to that extent and that level of struggle, and how afraid we are to struggle, and how afraid we are of the intensity of our emotions and the intensity of our experiences of embodiment, and how every little bout where they get to push themselves to this edge and feel their capacity to handle it and to tolerate it and to come back from it, to continue to act in it, it strengthens in them the capacity um, to be able to experience the signals of their body in relationship to their life without being overwhelmed by them. And I think when we're all of the locomotive play, it does that in relationship to our experience of the world around us. When we get into the manipulative play, it sets the ground for our capacity to break things down into pieces and to set up patterns and to recognize patterns and to solve puzzles. So there's this idea of the cerebellar loop, right? Abstract thought is linked into and is embodied in the capacity of the brain. So just like an athlete who has lots of diverse motor skills can more quickly adapt to a new motor demand, I believe that to a lesser degree, but to an important degree, thinking, because it's actually downstream of embodiment, is dependent to a significant degree on the capacity of the body to be able to bring new patterns to bear, to literally feel and see and think about it differently because the body has different things to donate to it. And I think that the manipulative is an important part of that. And then, as I already mentioned, in interacting with other people, there's something really, really incredible. Jordan Peterson talks about the idea that kids who haven't roughhoused a lot, they seem a little bit lost in their bodies. They don't know where their edges are. And of course, as we talked about with aggression, and then the flip side of that is sort of empathy. We don't have the same capacity to empathize. The research on mink shows that sexual competence is really damaged when animals are denied rough and tumble play in youth. And I think we see that as a real problem throughout our culture. There's a lot of young women who are consenting to sex that they actually don't want. A lot of young men who are having sex and who are not asking for sex that they want, or then asking for sex that's not wanted and then experiencing it, right? But not being able to see and feel the signal from their partner that it's unwanted. Because under the emotional intensity of the sexual engagement, um, they don't have the cognitive sophistication to actually feel the signals that are coming through. And especially when we add alcohol and drugs to the situation, it becomes really, really hard for people to do that. So in mink, what they see is that females who do not roughhouse find it much harder to refuse sexual engagement, and males who were not roughhoused are much more reticent to start a sexual engagement. So something like 65% of young men now have never asked a woman on a date, and so we've really lost the ability to just play. Just, flirtation and seduction is actually at its root a game. And it can be played well in a beautiful way, in a way that invites opening between two people, or it can be played very poorly in a way that most people are likely to get their feelings hurt.
Yeah. So, like, how how do you think things like evolve, move, play, and different practices that you've been working on can like better foster like gender relationships and like for an example like just bring about healthier intrasexual and intersexual like playful competition and cooperation and stuff like that? Like, can you elaborate on that?
Mm-hmm.
Like in the adult context, like how can that, since you brought that up?
Yeah, I mean, human beings are the most behaviorally flexible creatures on Earth, and in some sense, we are quite childlike even in adulthood. And there's some, disadvantages of that, and then there's some things that are really beautiful about that. But part of that is that we can still accomplish a lot of what we should have learned when we were young, even at advanced ages. So we still have the capacity to learn to be sophisticated partners, to read other people's signals well, to listen well, to have good sensitivity. Um, an analogy I really like is Jordan Peterson talks about this analogy, or I actually haven't heard him talk about it recently, but in his old work, he used to talk a lot about the analogy of resolution. So you can imagine that you're looking at a picture, and that picture can be made up of 64 bits, or it can be made up of 4,000 bits. And the picture that's made of 4,000 bits, of course, contains far more information. So you can imagine that in a wrestling exchange, a really good wrestler perceives many more opportunities for action than someone who's not. And what he's perceiving is a more finely expressed map of the potentials in that interaction. And the same thing is true of a good dancer. And the same thing is true of a good lover, right? They can perceive and play with that. So I remember when I was a young man, and I had really, for various reasons, due to sexual abuse and due to kind of social isolation downstream of homeschooling and maybe other things, I was very shy with women and very uncomfortable with women. And I really just didn't have any map of the space between sitting and talking to somebody and making out with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember the first time I sat with a woman and she like stroked my hand and started playing with my hand. And it had never occurred to me to like ante up into a romantic interaction by just putting my hand on a girl's hand and seeing how she responded.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we don't have is sort of like a deep embodied sense of what those appropriate small bids are. Right? If you're in a friendly, potentially romantic engagement with somebody, a lot of times what makes it feel icky or creepy or weird is because you move from a small your chunk is too big, your pixel's too large.
Yeah.
You're you know like
You're not calibrating the yeah, yeah.
right. If you go for the tongue kiss when she's ready for the hand touch, it's no good.
Yeah.
Um, and so what we've found is that people who come and do our rough and tumble play. So one thing is that just having a space that's, and we're really very specific about this, as much as I'm talking about sexuality, interestingly, we're very specific about our work not being directly about sexuality when we're doing it. So when
Hmm.
people come to us and work with us, we say, one, don't sleep with anybody new at the event. And we're not
Yeah.
going to play with any of these dynamics specifically in the work. And what that does is it creates an environment where men and women can engage really intensely and physically with each other with very high trust. We do a lot of work to build rapport and connection before we do like really heavy wrestling. And what we found is that women in particular, even more than men, seem to feel a sense of transformation in doing the rough housing. And there's a couple things that they say. One, it's really, really valuable to them to be able to be in a touch relationship with a man that's not sexual. Two, the the safety to push themselves as hard as they can with somebody and to feel that it's respected and that they'll get real engagement back, right? They want to be able to push their limits and they want a man to play with them such that they can really push the limits. A lot of women are actually afraid to hurt other women too. And so if they get to play with a man, then they're like, okay, I can go all out now. And then if a man doesn't sort of treat them too gently, but also
Hmm.
too rough, it can really feel incredibly empowering for them. And so that those two things have been really, really beautiful. But then people go away from our work and they come back and they say, hey, I did some of these games with my wife or my girlfriend or my boyfriend, and it was incredibly powerful in fostering deep romantic erotic connection between us. So so I think that there's, if we think about that idea that rough and tumble play regulates aggression and builds capacity for empathy. And if we put men and women together in a rough and tumble play context, and we make it explicitly a non-sexual context, we create the ground for a deep embodied connection between the sexes that is very trust enhancing and intimacy building. And that creates grounds that then, in the appropriate context, can be played with and become erotic connection. So I think it's a really, really profound thing that our culture has missed, and that helps a lot in men and women finding ways to connect to each other well.
Yeah, doesn't uh, women's like perceived sense of safety around like men increase the more they engage with like physical play with them or something like that? I heard you say something like the more they engage with men, actually their perception of how threatening men are, or their just innate discomfort overall around men in general goes down, and they feel safer and more confident or whatever.
I don't know of any specific like research on that.
Okay,
I just have the observation of what happens in our retreats and workshops, and then we can generalize and think about it theoretically from those
I
uh,
see.
points that I made.
So, um, some things I would imagine are more like when you're talking about like something like jujitsu or wrestling, that might be more. You can take the sexuality out of that completely, but something with contact improv, do you find that like harder to to do if because the dance has much more of a, I don't know, like sexual undertones to it. So then you might, it might be harder to hold off, and that might be more the appropriate lens to like explore the sexuality. And then the the jujitsu and wrestling is more just for rough and tumble play or something like that, or there's not quite a.
We played this one game that I'll just start with an example here. One game that we've played with recently. So one of my main co-teachers is a man named Aaron Cantor, who's a brilliant rough and tumble teacher. And Aaron has been spending some time with a woman named Bonita Roy, and she has horses. And so we went out and started spending some time with this one young horse. And this young stallion started playing this game with Aaron where it would try to put its head on top of Aaron's head, and then Aaron would try to put his head on top of the horse's head. And so we proposed this game as a game that we would play at the retreats. And so you're down on all fours and you're trying to kind of like put your head on top of the other person's head, you know, not too aggressively, but like that. And it's triggered quite sexual feelings for me multiple times and in other people. And so we're like kind of taking it out of the main frame because it feels too much like necking, and the kind of physical dynamics. The physical dynamics are too they're
Too
sort of
intimate. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like, oh, it's a great game for a couple, but it's not a great game for me
Strangers.
to play with a
Yeah.
female student necessarily.
Hmm.
Um, or at least it's a risk factor that we have to treat and be aware of. Uh,
Hmm.
and then so within the contact improv world in general, I find a lot of what I would call leaky sexuality. There's a lot of people who are hungry for intimacy and don't have maybe a sophisticated map of the gap between sexual intimacy and general intimacy. And a lot of men who are hungry, or women who are hungry for connection with the opposite sex, that is beyond just that. But we're able to use basically all of the main games within contact improv within our context and not really see this kind of experience of intense sexual connection.
Hmm.
So I don't think that it's necessary I think for the most part, all the games within contact improv can be played in this kind of cross-sexual context without sort of inviting in sexuality. I
Hmm.
think it's more about the culture and the setting and intention that we bring into that. I haven't played a lot with like tango or some of the more like sensual partner dances, and I think that people go there in part to really like have a really beautifully contained, mildly sexual interaction, um,
Hmm.
and that may be really educational in a really powerful and valuable way. But I can't speak about it too much because it's just outside of my zone. I do know that there are circumstances and places where it it can sexual energies are very powerful, and I think that they can be really rewarding to play with. Um, and I think that people, it can get a little chaotic, and I've seen a lot of spaces where I don't think it was held as responsibly as I would like it to, and maybe because I grew up in a culture where there was a lot of irresponsible sexuality and I was sexually abused. My tendency is to be very worried about making sure that containers are sufficiently closed to maintain safety around that.
So, like, what advice would you give to men who are struggling to make connections with women, but might have difficulty engaging with like rough and tumble play just because of limitations? Like myself, growing up, I had a little bit more mobility, so I could do things a little bit like jujitsu. Obviously, I had limitations because this hand I couldn't do a lot of two-handed maneuvers, but I could do really good chokes and I could do stuff. But then as I grew up, I lost some abilities, and I thought of doing stuff like contact improv, but then I thought I'd probably just hold the person back and frustrate them, and I might be perceived as the creep in that context just because of various stigma in society, and I just want to know what you would recommend to somebody who wants to foster like a healthy uh, sexual relationship and wants to engage in more physical activity as well, but doesn't necessarily have like standard ability set.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I would encourage you to try to stay involved with as much of it as you can. And not always, but more frequently, the men who are worried about being creeps are not the men who are creeps,
Yeah.
right? So
True.
if you have those guards up in yourself, be aware and pay attention to how people respond. But but don't be so guarded that you don't give yourself the opportunity to go play the game,
To go do things. Yes, exactly.
right? And um, a sophisticated player and a really giving player and a caring player can get a lot out of interactions, even when there's a big gap in ability.
Hmm. You
So
talked about this, like with handicapping things. If somebody's stepping on a curb, if you want to sway momentum, you can like just a finger or some like do
yeah,
different. Yeah, so
yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah, absolutely. And so I think that having more confidence in your body and its interaction with other bodies will help you, make the connections that you want to make. Um,
Hmm.
and, um, and, women are really attracted to men who are highly agentic, who go out and try to make stuff happen in the world, and they'll forgive a lot if you really really show that you're passionate and you show up and you're consistent and you try to make stuff happen. um, that can lead to a lot of beautiful places.
Hmm. So I want to jump to something. I was curious about your thoughts on like the increase in rates of like stimulants. I'm not on any. This is just a general question, and how the suppression for the urge to like move and play, especially in adults now, because we're seeing increasing rates. But it was like historically used in childhood, like to for ADHD and stuff. But we're seeing increasing rates even in adulthood and stuff.
Mhm.
Um, like, what's your thoughts on that, and how can we, I guess, overcome that, or what's an antidote to that kind of because a lot of people just don't feel the urge to do things, or they're living very sedentary lifestyles, like so.
Yeah. So there's often this idea that people who have ADHD have a um, paradoxical response to stimulants because stimulants make ADHD people more focused. But it's
Hmm.
actually not paradoxical. The reality is that stimulants of all kinds can inhibit play drive. So uh, Adderall is useful to everybody who wants to make themselves do something that their nervous system would have a hard time doing, right? It is not
Hmm.
healthy or natural for a human being to spend 48 hours coding in a row.
Hmm.
Um, and you can do that if you're on Adderall or amphetamine or meth, right? Um, so it's a tool that's available, and I won't judge people for occasionally using the tool. But the problem is that we have an expectation that actually we should all be able to behave as if we're always on meth
Hmm.
culture. And the way that we treat children reflects that. And part of it is that we fundamentally treat play and work as antonyms. And that's not really the case. Play is not inherently non productive. Play is actually one of our most profound states that gives us access to the capacity to learn quickly and actually to be very productive in the right way. So play is a difficult muse because um, when you need to get one thing done, it doesn't always want to do that thing with you. But if you can find your drive for play and your passion in the long run, what the things that are inherently um, desirable to do as forms of play become, the best guide to the things that you will want to do. And there's a lot of people who grind and grind and grind through willpower and through through, maybe they start with coffee, and then it's nicotine, and then it's modafinil, and then it's Adderall, and then it's meth, and you know and they've they reached their early 30s, and they've got their tech startup package and lots of money, and they just absolutely miserable, and they have no idea who they are, and then they go do ayahuasca and get one shot and end up being tantric sex teachers. Sorry for my rather funny thing here, but I think what's happening there is that you've invested in a certain part of your brain. You've hyper,
Hmm.
but it's not the whole. It's not all of you. And by becoming so hyper focused on that part of you, you neglect all these other aspects of you. And you can end up in a life that, even though it's very successful from the outside, is actually utterly miserable. And then you might need something like ayahuasca to just like wake you up to all these other aspects of you that you've suppressed. So I think that, you know, the capitalist system, I always find it fun. As soon as I start to critique capitalism, I always worry people I'm going to think I'm just some socialist hippie, because I actually think there's really, really good things about the capitalist system. But I think that the capitalist system is a paperclip problem. Are you familiar with the paperclip?
Yeah, like the paperclip maximizer. If you tell like
Yeah,
an AI uh, tr- meet this goal, and then it misinterprets the goal, and then does something outrageous, and then kills everybody somehow.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I think capitalism is actually or is a collective distributed intelligence network that
Hmm.
optimizes for the production of capital, which is related to, but imperfectly correlated with well-being. So capital means houses, capital means electricity, capital means antibiotics. And we are incredibly lucky that capitalism has been so effective at optimizing for all of the production of all of these things. And at the same time, it is against the production of marriages. It's against the production of healthy relationships with children. It's against the production of churches and community groups and all of these things. Every relationship that cannot be financialized is is invisible to capitalism.
Hmm.
The value of it is invisible to capitalism. Um, so I don't. I'm not. I'm not. I'm. I actually think it's very dangerous to try to get rid of capitalism as a system and replace it with something like socialism. I think that's actually the wrong thesis. The right thesis is that we need countervailing systems that actually address the other aspects of well-being, and we need to really understand as a culture that the GDP does not equal happiness. Um, that there's really good research that shows that above a certain income threshold, which is very variable depending on where you live, but above a certain income threshold, there's no net increase in well-being associated with increase in money, and yet people keep going for the money. you know
Hmm.
and and what really makes things great is relationships.
Hmm.
This is actually a huge thing, huge sort of passion project of mine. My wife and I broke up for 4 months last year, and it kicked off like a really profound healing process for both of us. And we were able to come back to our marriage, and it's been incredibly beautiful. While we were broken up, I was reading Twitter, and somebody posted something that says something like, which do you think is more difficult to find, a good job or a good spouse? And everybody in the thread said a good spouse. But
Hmm.
nobody behaves as if good spouses are harder to come by than good jobs.
Hmm.
Um, and so we we spend a lot of time talking to young people about, what are you going to do when you grow up? What's your job? What's college? What's this? Nobody says to young people, who you marry is way more important than your career.
Hmm.
The person you choose to have children and with is the most important decision you'll ever make, and how you treat that person in the years to come is the thing that will define your life more than anything else. Um, but you know, I suppose capitalism has been not been entirely unpleased by my relationship with my wife, because we've paid for lots of therapy and things like that. But
Yeah, so to touch on that, I think this relates to something you said about I guess hypernormal stimuli, because a lot of what is created downstream of capitalism, a lot of these technology and things like that, like hypernormal stimuli. How do we ensure that like it doesn't outcompete like normal healthy stimuli? Like I don't want to demonize like video games and stuff like that, but I've heard you talk about like this kind of issue, and I think it really relates to what you're saying in terms of like certain capitalist systems that just want like people to consume things and buy things and become addicted through hypernormal stimuli, um, and maybe not pay attention to the things that really do matter in life, like relationships and what. So, do you want to speak on that a little bit?
yeah, so there's kind of two directions my brain is going. One is on this idea of hypernormal stimuli, and the other is on this. Yeah. Um, Many years ago, I was sitting with a friend of mine, Stephen Guillenet, who's a neurobiology PhD who studied the neuromechanisms behind obesity. And he said that what the food industry did was that they divorced flavor from nutrition. And it created an insight cascade for me, because I could see that if we can conceive of junk food as flavor divorced from nutrition, I can have the sweetness of an apple without any of the water or fiber or micronutrients. And I can have the sweetness 10x the sweetness of an apple and an apple Jolly Rancher. Um, that if we can see it that way, we can see that pornography produces a hyper normal stimulus that that takes us away from the actual nourishment of deep connection, intimacy, and relationship. Right? I can log on today to Pornhub and see, more perfect perky breasts and round
Yeah,
booties than any man in history ever saw. Right?
yeah, no doubt.
Over the course of an hour. Um, if I go and I wrestle and I do parkour, I will become fatigued within an hour and a half, and I'll be sore the next day. And I might not win, or I might bounce off a jump, or I might lose to somebody, right? Um, or I could, play Skyrim, and I could run and jump and climb and kill thousands of people in 4 hours of continuous play and experience no fatigue.
Hmm.
Um, so for me, video games are thrill divorced from physicality. Pornography is sexuality divorced from relationship, just as junk food is flavor divorced from nutrition. And in my own life, I've simply chosen to not do these things. Um, I I stopped. The last video game I played was Skyrim, um, and that was literally I've only played the Elder Scrolls series in the last 20 years. Um, and I stopped looking at pornography, I think 3 years ago. I probably had a slightly excessively high use of pornography when I was younger, because I think of the ways that I reacted to my experience of sexual abuse, and it took me a long time to kind of like recognize how much that was a reality underneath me. But I chose to just stop completely. Um, and I think that for most people, that's the right decision. And I think that, if you were to play video games, you would want to be really, really careful about how you play, what you play, which games, how they stimulate you, and what context you allow yourself to play. And the same thing with something like pornography. I stopped watching pornography actually not for myself, not to get out of my own loops, but because I became hyper concerned about the ethics of how I was contributing to the attention system that was potentially bringing a lot of people into harmful situations. And especially as I began to wrestle with my own experience of sexual abuse, I began to realize that like every young woman that I looked at on camera was probably herself a victim of sexual abuse, but but very like well, at least there's a high likelihood that she would be, and that I had no way to control whether what I was looking at was actually a healthy expression of sexuality,
Mm-hmm.
and that any attention that I put into pornography um, was feeding a system that captures hurt young people and hurts them more. And then when I had stopped looking at pornography, I realized how much it was feeding my own insensitivity to and callousness to the reality of my like deep internal feelings around sexuality, and in desensitizing myself to the beauty and connection with my spouse. Um, so I think that the less we can connect with any of these things, the better. And social media is one of the worst too, right? Social media is social approval, divorced from real relationships, right? I can go on, I could, very easily sort of cultivate a bunch of parasocial relationships with people who agree with me on everything, who will just praise me for, trolling the left or trolling the right, or, hating on, the fitness industry, whatever kind of little axis I wanted to. But I could have thousands of anonymous people who praise me every day because I'm a culture warrior for whatever thing, and none of those people are real relationships. None of those people I can trust to like, help me with my kids. Um, and the attention that I put on them is attention that I'm not spending on my children and on my family and um, on my wife. So I still use social media. I I really admire all my friends who've gotten off of it. My career is connected enough to it that I don't feel ready to, that I don't feel like it's professionally possible for me to let it go.
Yeah, it's kind of a multipolar trap. You can't really do your job successfully in a system that you need it to function in modernity, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm stuck on the social media front. Um, but I take breaks, and I try to have discipline around times that I work with it, and I pray. I pray to not let it manipulate me too much,
Mm-hmm.
to continue to show up. Um, One thing you'll see in the sort of social media grindcore world is this thing: be so excellent they can't ignore you. And I think it's a terrible, terrible saying, because who the fuck cares what they think about you? Who's they, right?
Yeah,
They is the mob.
and it's hard to define like excellence in a way that's like universally accepted too, right?
So I've tried to change in my mind. Be so excellent that all of the people closest to you know how deeply you love them, and how much and how well you can show up for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I, let me just think about where I want to take this next. I have a lot of questions, but since we're talking so much about the area of sexuality and stuff, I thought I might just want to. I saw one of your posts recently talking about how you cherish monogamy or something like that, but you think we can benefit from like other uh, subcultures like polyamory and kink, and I'm very interested in all that sort of stuff. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on where that's really applicable, because I've never been in a polyamorous relationship, but I'm kind of like an advocate for them just because I think it. I'm very on board with Jeffrey Miller's interpretation of how it could benefit society in the sense of like the guy who's not really, um, I guess, appropriate for like a full time boyfriend or not the most desirable, let's say, might still be able to fill a niche capacity or be like a side partner for someone if they, or they might just need some leveling up before they can be a full time partner. In other cases, they might not be. But I was just wondering what your thoughts were because I saw that in a Facebook post recently, and since we're talking so much about that, I figured it'd be okay to ask about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an open book. I
Yeah.
pretty much talk about whatever people ask me to.
Yeah.
It's been extreme honesty has been a choice I made a long time ago, but uh,
Yeah, me too. It can be hard sometimes, but
yeah, it's interesting. That post was originally posted in 2018,
okay.
and I reposted it, and I was like, "Oh, there's some quibbles I would have with this," and I think that one of the main things that I would sort of reframe if I said it now is I think I would be much more careful about offering praise for those communities. I'm much more strongly a believer in monogamy now in a lot of ways. I think theoretically, I've really been aligned with monogamy for a long time. If you look at something like Joseph Henrich's work on the weirdest people on earth, part of what's made Western society uniquely good in a lot of ways is our strong commitment to male monogamy. Many societies have a commitment to female monogamy, or at least to a certain class of women being monogamous. There's often a bifurcation of women into a monogamous class and a non-monogamous class, or essentially prostitutes. Um, but uh, but it was really Christian society that first said male sexual chastity is also valuable,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw how that was good for society. But in myself, the reality is that I was really afraid of sex, actually, because I've been sexually abused. And part of what happened was that I, without essentially realizing it, I kind of cut myself off energetically from my wife um, in certain ways, and I made myself insensitive to how much she actually meant to me, and it created a lot of barriers between us. And one of the reactions to that barriers in me was a hunger for other women. Right? I was traveling the world. There was beautiful women who would show up, not so much my students, but like friends of my students who I would be with in social situations around the events that I was teaching. And I realized that there was these kind of short term engagements that were available to me, and I didn't take them up, but I was tempted. I was really tempted multiple times. Um, and I had lots of friends who were poly, and they were sort of singing the praises to me. I'm like, why aren't you taking advantage of this? And I realized over time that like just being around that was very toxic for me. It was really not helping me with my goals. And when my wife broke up with me at the beginning of the year, I went through 6 weeks of 6 days a week of internal family systems therapy and a week of somatic therapy. At the end of it, I did an MDMA trip. And in the middle of that MDMA trip, I was processing my sexual abuse, saying like, don't touch me, don't touch me, don't touch me, right? Thinking about the person who abused me. Don't touch me, that's my soul. And I was, like, I had a very intense experience with that MDMA. Apparently, about 3% of people who do MDMA will experience tremors. I was probably the most intense tremoring that the therapist had ever seen. I was literally shaking like this for 4 hours, but it would kind of come and go in waves. And so as I came down out of that wave, I said, that was always for you, Beth, right? That was always for her, right? This was always supposed to be for you. I never needed all those other things. I never needed to be famous. I never needed to be super rich. I never needed other women. It was always my soul was always supposed to be for her, was the feeling that I got coming out of that trip. And in the wake of that trip, I've been able to experience an, an awakening into sexual connection and love with my wife that is the most incredibly precious thing I've ever experienced in my life, along with my children. And I really strongly believe that it is only possible in a relationship where the man and the woman both know that they are utterly and completely and only committed to each other. And I think that a lot of polyamory is actually driven by people being unwilling to take the risk to fully love another person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no doubt that monogamy is a very useful social technology. Um,
It
I
is that. And I also think it is the highest expression of our nature, right? Like people talk about it's not natural. And it isn't. It isn't natural in the sense that, like, that's what people will just do. But it is a capacity that is within our nature, and it is the highest expression, right? It's not natural to be able to do double backflips, but it's within our nature to be able to do double backflips. And it's a really, really incredible thing when you can do it. A really, truly dedicated, absolutely committed monogamous relationship is the highest expression of the sexual nature of a human being, in my opinion.
mm-hmm. Do you still think there's insights that can be learned though from other even if you don't practice them yourself,
Yeah.
like just as an intellectual abstraction, is there anything, because you did mention that, so I was just wondering what your thoughts were at the time, even if you disagree with them now.
I think at the time what I was pointing to was that I think polyamory invites people to have conversations about consent, and what is acceptable and what works for them, maybe at a deeper level, right? I think that there's a kind of default monogamy or a sort of naive monogamy that we're kind of handed by our culture, which can, where we can rely on a cultural script that that then impedes us in the deep communication that actually creates connection between people, and that sometimes the movement towards polyamory um, actually just opens the channels to communicate about the reality of the romantic and sexual connection that you are hungry for and want with your partner. And so I think that's really valuable. When it comes to kink, I think that there's a reality to dominance and submission in the male and female sexual relationship.
Hmm.
Something submissive about accepting someone into your body. And there's something about male aggression that has to be called out in the sexual connection. And I think there's something really beautiful in that, and that our theory of total egalitarianism between men and women and identity can actually kind of kill the sexual connection in a negative way. But I also see an enormous amount of very damaging things that are happening within kink. And I'm very, very worried about, like, how many young women want to be choked right now. And I think a lot of that has to do with exposure to pornography, but people are dying. And
Hmm.
and sex and consensual sex looks more and more like abuse in a way that makes it really hard to say, oh, those bruises around my neck are because somebody actually was physically abusing me, and have them not say, oh, she wanted that. And I think that a lot of this is driven by these wounds, these deep wounds between men and women. So what I would say yes to about polyamory is better communication. What I'd say yes to about kink is acceptance of some kind of layer of the surrender and assertion dynamic between men and women. But what I would say no to is the level of violence and degradation, and the reality that polyamorous want to get rid of jealousy. They think it's an irrational emotion, and it's like it's this rejection of nature, right? You have to reject nature one way or the other, I guess. It's natural
Yes.
for me to experience desire towards other women. It's natural for me to experience desire towards, uh, jealousy if someone is engaging with my spouse. But I think that the healthiest thing is the utter commitment to the one person.
Yeah, I think jealousy is a very interesting thing. I've I'm never been super prone to romantic jealousy, although I've never been in enough situations to know, because I've only had one partner, I guess, for a very brief period, because it's very hard to get a partner when you're in my circumstance. But I will say that I wouldn't want to, like, if you could CRISPR out jealousy, I wouldn't want that. I think it has an evolutionary purpose, but I think we should still be skeptical of jealousy. I don't mean just the romantic kind, but when you're you're jealous of a friend or something success. I think a lot of people are prone to jealousy in circumstances where you should be happy for another person. So I think the idea of compersion can be exported out of polyamory to non-sexual relational context where you basically have like sympathetic joy or empathy for another person. And I think that's a more healthy, but I wouldn't want to get rid of jealousy. Obviously it serves a real purpose. But I think we should still be skeptical of when and why we're feeling it. And then, like, does that make sense? Oh, yes, that makes sense because X or Y. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think compersion, more broadly speaking, is a good concept?
I'm not familiar with that word.
So compersion is a term that was coined by polyamorous to describe the feeling of happiness or basically positive valence compassion for their partner experiencing love with another partner and just being happy for them even though it's not with them. They're not feeling jealous, but they're feeling like happiness
Sure.
for them. So I think that can be exported to non romantic or non sexual related just to be happy for another friend. I think this is kind of a useful thing because some people can be hyper competitive in the modern world. Oh, I wish I got that. Oh,
Yeah.
you got that, like, you know. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the ability to take joy in somebody else's joy is really wonderful, and I think that that having greater security in yourself uh, is useful. Um, I've certainly, I think that we've all felt at times like jealousy of the connections that other people might have with people we care about. You might be jealous of your brother or sister for a
mhm.
connection with a parent. You might be jealous of a connection between two friends that are now becoming closer, who you might have felt closer to one or the other. Um, I think sexual jealousy. I think it's a mistake to treat sexual jealousy as the same. Uh, that's my
There.
take, because I think that sexual jealousy in a lot of ways is um, it really has to do with the fundamental dynamics of reproduction and the stability of a reproductive bond and the care that's needed for children. Like there was a time, one of my reasons why I never really explored polyamory was just this simple thought experiment of like, even if my wife was okay with me being with other women, that it would take a lot of time and energy to try to cultivate relationships with other women. There would be time and energy that I was not devoting to maintaining and growing the bond that I had with the mother of my children. And so even if she wasn't jealous of it, I was still failing to put my attention where it would best serve my children. And obviously, not everyone has children, but I think that the sexual bond, I think that we make a mistake in our culture by not contextualizing the sexual bond as fundamentally in relationship to the formation of families.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess where I come from with that is probably because I've just been unwanted so much. I have a different association with the concept of it, whereas maybe you're trying to hold on to something. I can't even imagine what it would be like to be sexually abused. That must be terrible, and I'm sorry to hear that you've gone through that. But I definitely know what it's like to feel unwanted, and I'm just wondering if you think even if it's not useful for you, if you think it could have context for other people where it could be beneficial, or you think it's like an innately uh, bad thing, like it has a net positive, sorry, a net negative rather, impact on society, and people should really try to kind of steer away from it, and or which yeah.
I mean, I think I understand what you're saying. For some reason, what comes up first to me is like I liked polyamory better when it was just called dating, and everyone was expected to go through a phase of life where they were experimenting with courtship of multiple people, right? I think that a big part of the problem is that we don't prioritize marriage and we don't understand how vital and important marriage is and what a marriage can be. And so a lot of times people are sort of just living in a suspended adolescence for an extremely extended period of time. And we love adolescence. We love that phase of sexual courtship and chase as a, that's where all our stories and music is about. Um, and I just think it's fundamentally it's supposed to be a short period of someone's life, right? It's like
Yeah, it's like
you
a
can be polyamorous.
development
Yeah.
stage or phase of life. Yeah, I would like pair bonding. I would agree is super important, even if you're polyamorous. I don't think the kind of relationship anarchy version of it can like last. I think you still need to have a primary partner at some point long term. Um, but I think you can be polyamorous without practicing polyamory, if that makes sense. You can you would be able to like accept like or at least not end a relationship if somebody uh did something outside of it, but you don't need to be actively seeking it. Like it doesn't necessarily have to come with a lifestyle. Do you think there's versions of like, I guess it was Dan Savage who spoke about the concept of monogamish. He talked about um basically you're monogamous most of the time, but like if some shit happens, we're adults. We're not gonna ruin a whole family over it. We're not gonna split our finances. We're not gonna scream at each other and get the cops involved or whatever the thing is, right? Um, I don't
So
mean to fixate on this too much. We've kind of got off the kind of script of what I planned to chat about, but I just am interested in this because you brought up sexuality so much. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to go down this
sure,
path.
my mind
But
went. Um, yeah,
sorry, I didn't hear
like
what you said.
I said, I'm not sure why that was where my mind went when we talked about these things, but it's always an interesting trip when to see as the questions come in what they trigger.
No, that's all good.
I'm familiar with that. I read that essay years ago. Dan Savage is a gay man. You know,
Yeah, I know
being
he's gay.
you know being gay is a very different world because children are not going to come into the family just because. And I'm not sure that the sort of psychological dynamics are even necessarily the same. Right? I've seen
Hmm.
research that shows that, um, you know, if a man has sex with another woman, his neurohormonal milieu changes in relationship to his primary partner.
Hmm.
Right? Like I think we're playing. One of my big things is that I think part of the things that confuses people about me is that is just how committed I am to the idea of human nature, I suppose.
Hmm.
And I think that just as I think that like we have to train in a way that's coherent to human nature, we have to like be realistic to human nature in a lot of ways. I saw a quote I liked recently, which was the true reactionary is not a dreamer of abolished pasts, but a chaser of eternal shades on the everlasting hills, something like that.
Hmm.
Um, when I look at the history of human relationships, it seems to me that the ones that have really done the best for men and women and children is the monogamous tradition, right? And when it's truly sacralized.
Yeah, for families, yes, but for sure.
And I think that ultimately, I think family is the fundamental unit of society. And I realize, like we're standing in very different places. I'm a father, right? I'm
Yeah.
21 years into a relationship with a woman who I'm desperately in love with. And, and I know,
And I'm a corporal incel, so it's like a complete different world experience.
yeah. So
Basically.
when Diana Fleischman talks about ethical, ethical non-monogamy as a like way to ease the pain of people who are not going to find partnership as easy. right? I understand why that is inherently attractive. And I think I don't know, like, I'm not going to say that there's no room for it in society, or there's nowhere that that's the appropriate way, or there's not a subculture where it's the appropriate thing, or not a stage of life where it's the appropriate thing. What I want to do is I want to sing the praises of monogamy. I want people to know how valuable it is and what it is that you're sacrificing when you let go of it.
Oh yeah, you're sacrificing a lot. Like I would agree.
So that's my take.
Is there um, anything else you want to talk about in that? Like, I don't know what your time is like. I don't want to go over your.
I usually schedule 90 minutes for a podcast, so we've got another 20 minutes if you have
Uh,
other topics you want to get
well,
into.
I do have other, but they're kind of. It'll be all scattered and all over the place now because we've gone. So it might seem a bit disjointed, but
It's okay.
let me see what I have here. Okay, so I guess this can relate to relationships too, but I mean like intimate, but like any human relationship really. You talked about like how to know when to start and end a confrontation or fight. Do you want to get into that a little bit? Like, I think that basically goes back to a little bit when you were talking about. I think when you were talking about the dog and the biting and all that sort of thing, and knowing how to handle rough and tumble play and just relationships more generally. Um, do you want to get into that, or do you not know what I'm referencing?
I'm not sure exactly what you're referencing. You know, yeah. Let me see if I can generate anything interesting. The I'm a pretty confrontational person. Actually, I'm quite assertive by nature, and um, my tendency is to think that it's better to have the fight that you need to have when you need to have it. Um, I think obviously uh, my what I've needed to do in my own relationships is to what happens a lot in my when with my wife and I now is that we sort of like we'll we'll kick off, let's say, about something. We're talking about something, and all of a sudden, you'll have this feeling of frustration or upset or not feeling heard. And it'll be about a topic, and maybe we're arguing about immigration policy, right? And what I notice is that usually there's a fight that's below the fight, if that makes sense. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, we're talking about this, but really there's a sense of not feeling seen that has to do with like long-term patterns. And if I can let go of wanting to win the fight about whatever the seemingly momentary conflict is and attend to this deeper source of disconnection, um, the fight usually ends up being unimportant. And rather than a fight ending with further disconnection, it leads me into deeper connection with her. And I don't think that that's always universally there, but I try more and more to do that with everybody, right? Ultimately, I think that love is redemptive. And I think that um, love is love is challenging. It's extraordinarily challenging, right? Christ says the way is steep and narrow, right? Um, because there's these two poles to it. One pole, I've been thinking a lot about C.S. Lewis. He talks about the sternness of love. One pole is the sternness of love, to say, you know, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say I like polyamory right now, right?
No,
Um,
no,
you know what I
that's
mean?
fine.
That's the ability
Yeah.
to hold firmly in a place, right? But not from a place of reactivity. And then there's this otherness, which is like I can see why that would matter to you, right? And I can understand the wound and the hurt. Um, and so I think a lot about this idea of how can I stand this painful balance between tenderness and sternness. Um, and I think that that's what's ultimately redemptive. So when I'm in a conflict with someone, I don't want to love them by simply avoiding the conflict and accepting wherever they're at, and offering them unconditional positive regard, because we need to be able to hold each other to the fire. But I also don't want to. I also think it's very, very important to remember to root that in care in some really deep way. And so I meditate on things like that. I meditate on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Whichever side you're on in that conflict, or whatever side you're sort of identified with, whichever side you think is correct or morally justified, there are real human beings on both sides who really suffer, like at an intense level, who were motivated, and people who did terrible things who were motivated to do terrible things by really beautiful, meaningful things, right? I love my family. I would fight for my family. I will die for my family. And people are dying and killing for their families.
Mhm.
And so if you decide that you believe that the Israelis are justified, or you decide that you believe that the Palestinians are justified, then you have to face the other side with a level of sternness and say, yeah, it sucks what's happening, but to get to the end of this fight, this has to happen, right? Or like it has to. It will continue until you decide to not have it continue, right? And that's the sternness. But within that sternness, there's an emotional, what I would call a simplifying assumption that's available. If I want to say that I cannot justify taking you out of this suffering, right? Um, I can make that easier on myself by saying you're actually not a moral agent, and that you don't matter, and that the goods that you care about are not real goods. But that's not true. It's not true, right? I saw I saw I saw a picture of Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attack, with a hole in his head, coated in concrete um, concrete debris. And I went and I prayed. I prayed that he would escape hell. I prayed that I prayed that he I prayed to know in myself that he was motivated by love for the people that he lived around. And that even if it was turned to the darkest of things, that I can recognize the local good that he was trying to serve, and that I could sympathize with it. So I don't know if that has anything to do with the question you asked, but that's what's on my mind around
Well,
that.
it touches on it. It's a good response. I like it. One other thing I want to get into for sure, because I just realized I had this and I want to get this in the time we have. Um, so how do you think well, I guess we touched on this a little bit, but um, I'll expand on it. So how can we renew relationships in the meaning crisis, and what do you know about the three P's mentioned by John Vervaeke, and how does it apply to your work? How do you feel that applies to your work? Because I've heard you talk about that, and and I want your take on that. That would be really cool.
So there's four P's, which are
Oh,
ways that
okay.
ways that we know the world, and they're propositional. So we know the world as semantic arrangements of information. So, for instance, Greenland is currently uh, legally controlled by Denmark. That's a propositional knowledge that I have. I've never been to Greenland. I don't have any friends who are from Greenland. I don't have any uh, lived experience of what it's like to be in Greenland or what it's like to be engaged in those relationships. It's just, you know, if I woke up tomorrow and Greenland didn't actually exist, all that would have to change in my mind is a proposition. There is procedural knowledge, which is knowledge of how, right? So I know what is true about Greenland status, but I don't know anything about how, right? How to, negotiate Greenland status, right? So I know how to do a Kong vault. And I can explain to you how to do a Kong vault, and you can know what a Kong vault is, but you would know how to do it. So procedural
Mm-hmm.
information, which is stored in motor memory. So there's, I think it's, what is it called? So there's semantic memory, episodic memory, and I can't remember the name of the one that has to do with this. I think maybe
Mm-hmm.
procedural memory. I think it is procedural memory.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. And then there's perspectival, which is like, I know what it's like to live my life as a 6'2", 200 plus pound man, with dark hair and blue eyes. And I know what it's like to live my life as somebody who does parkour. And I can't entirely know what it's like to feel your milk let down when a baby screams that a woman experiences. I'll never experience labor, right? Those are perspectival things. And then participatory, which is how we know by being. So perspectival knowledge is episodic, right? It's associated with the episodic memory system. There's a memory system that unites you as you, that somehow tells you that you are the same as the person that you were in the past, which is actually kind of absurd at a certain level because every cell is different than you were 10 years ago, and your thoughts are different, and you live in different circumstances, but somehow you have this sense of continuity, and that is stored as your participatory memory, or your sense of self memory. So these are the four systems of knowledge. And when we engage with our practices, one of the key ideas that John Vervaeke has is that we live in the tyranny of the propositional. We think we know the world when we have propositions about it, when the knowledge that actually makes us feel connected deeply is the procedural, perspectival, and participatory aspects of knowledge. And so we can be hungry for propositional knowledge, and we can feed ourselves lots of propositional knowledge, but end up deeply disconnected from the world. So that's my understanding of the four Ps and how they've kind of informed my work. But the other question that you asked was something about how we come into relationships, and I'm not sure how the two are connected.
Sorry. I said something about how can we renew relationships in the meaning crisis. I was kind of tying together John Vervaeke's concept of like the meaning crisis and something you said about renewing relationships. Was it? But it's all good. Yeah.
Yeah, renew relationships in the sense like of all the relationships we talk about, the relationships internal to the self,
Yeah.
relationship of to the landscape. Essentially the answer is, evolve, move, play, right? Like that's the work, is to do that, right? So the fundamental thing is that you have to move your body, and as you move your body, you need to cultivate openness to the emotional layers, to the full experience of the body, which I'm discovering is quite a challenge, actually, and that most of us are really failing to tolerate and experience all of the actual affective charge of the body. And so things like somatics are really, really powerful tools to actually cultivate that in us. And then there's this world that we're embedded in, and we have to do things in the world to the best of our abilities. Try to grow with what you have, or hold on to what you have, or
Mm-hmm.
find ways around what you have to increase your capacity for relationship to the world. And then we want to be able to make things and do things and play with things, and then we need to be able to do that with other human beings. And if we have really embodied practices of this, like parkour and somatics and juggling and, rope flow and roughhousing and dancing, that's going to give us perspectival, participatory, and procedural knowledge of the world that's, far more real than any level of book learning. And if we can cultivate that deeply, I think that is actually the answer to the meaning crisis.
Mm-hmm. So I think we can wrap up here. We covered some pretty good ground, and I'm very happy that we. I mean, I can say goodbye to you off air. I think I should just wrap it up, and then we can say goodbye.
Sounds good.
Off air.